The idea doesn't land as fear. It lands as unease with familiarity. The beast hiding inside your house doesn't feel like an intruder, it feels like something that has always been there, unnoticed because it learned how to blend in. Not loud, not violent, quiet, patient, embedded in the routine of your daily life. That's why this thought lingers longer than it should. You've sensed it before, in moments when your own space felt subtly draining instead of restorative, when being home didn't fully feel like refuge. Not because something was wrong on the surface, but because something underneath was feeding quietly. Habits, patterns, emotional residues, old dynamics that survived simply because they were familiar. The beast doesn't break doors. It hides behind comfort. This isn't about an external threat. It's about proximity. The most influential forces in your life were never the obvious ones. They were the ones close enough to shape you without announcing themselves. Beliefs you didn't question because they felt inherited. Emotional responses you didn't choose because they felt automatic. Expectations that lived in the walls long before you noticed they weren't yours. The house here is symbolic. It represents your inner structure, what you return to when the world goes quiet. Your routines, your default thoughts, the emotional climate you live inside when no one is watching. And somewhere in that structure, something learned how to survive by staying unexamined. Not evil, not monstrous, simply misaligned and hungry for attention. You may notice how resistance rises when this idea touches certain areas, a reflex to dismiss it, to say, this is just how things are. That reflex isn't accidental. Anything that feeds on repetition depends on being normalized. The beast doesn't want confrontation. It wants continuation. It thrives when you mistake familiarity for safety. This is why change has felt harder in private than in public. You can adapt to the outside world. You can perform, adjust, succeed. But returning home internally sometimes pulls you backward. Old moods resurface. Old doubts regain strength. Old limitations feel heavier. That's not because you're weak. It's because something inside your house has been shaping the environment quietly. The beast doesn't announce itself as danger. It presents as comfort, habit, or this is just who I am. It lives in unchallenged corners, in rooms you stopped entering consciously, in assumptions you never revisited, and because it never attacked directly, it was allowed to stay. This story isn't about panic or paranoia. It's about awareness, about recognizing that what's closest to you has the greatest influence over you. And that mastery doesn't begin by fighting what's outside, but by turning inward with clarity. You're not being warned because you're powerless. You're being warned because you're finally ready to see. And once you see what has been hiding inside your house, the story doesn't become darker. It becomes honest. Once awareness enters the house, nothing dramatic happens at first. That's what makes it unsettling. The walls don't shake. The lights don't flicker. Everything looks the same. And yet, you feel a shift in how you move through familiar rooms. You begin to notice what you used to step around without thinking. Corners you avoided. Patterns you assumed were fixed. Silence that carried more weight than it should. You start to realize that the beast didn't arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by repetition. Every time you ignored a feeling instead of naming it. Every time you chose comfort over clarity. Every time you told yourself, this is fine, when something inside you knew it wasn't. These weren't failures. They were survival strategies that outlived their usefulness. And survival strategies, when left unchecked, can become captors. The beast feeds on routine without reflection. It thrives in the gap between awareness and action. Not because it's strong, but because it's familiar. Familiarity lowers vigilance. You stop questioning what you live with every day. You stop checking whether it still serves you. And slowly, the environment adapts around it. your thoughts, your emotional reactions, your expectations of yourself. You may notice how certain moods seem to activate the moment you're alone, how doubts speak louder at night, how old narratives regain authority when no one is there to counter them. This isn't coincidence. The beast doesn't roam freely, it waits for privacy. It knows that when external pressure is gone, internal defaults take over. That's where it holds influence. This is why growth has often felt easier outside than inside. You can change behaviors. You can improve performance. You can succeed visibly. But the internal house, your private climate, lags behind. Not because you didn't try, but because you didn't yet see what was shaping it. You can't renovate a room you don't realize is occupied. There's no need to rush this realization. Panic only strengthens what feeds on chaos. What weakens the beast is clarity. Naming patterns without judgment. Observing reactions without identifying with them. Noticing what drains you without immediately trying to destroy it. Awareness alone begins to starve what relied on being unseen. You're not confronting an enemy. You're uncovering a misalignment that overstayed its welcome. The beast survived because it was useful once. It protected you when you needed protection. But protection has an expiration date. When it stays too long, it becomes limitation. As this understanding settles, a question forms quietly, not "how do I fight this?" but "why did this need to hide in the first place?" That question doesn't accuse. It invites truth. And truth is something the beast cannot adapt to. Because once the house is fully seen, nothing inside it can pretend it belongs there without your consent. And consent is what's beginning to change. As consent shifts, the dynamic inside the house changes. You're no longer moving on autopilot. You pause where you used to rush. You question where you once complied. This doesn't make life heavier. It makes it clearer. The beast senses this immediately. Not as threat, but as exposure. What survives on assumption weakens under attention. You begin to see how certain inner reactions aren't responses to the present at all. They're echoes. Old alarms that still ring even though the danger has passed. You notice how quickly they try to define the moment. Don't try. Stay small. This will end badly. These voices don't argue logically. They rely on familiarity. They speak with the authority of repetition, not truth. The house has rooms built around these echoes, thought loops that feel inevitable, emotional responses that arrive fully formed. You once mistook these rooms for who you are. Now you realize they're just spaces you learned to occupy. And anything learned can be unlearned, not by force, but by refusal to live there anymore. You may feel a subtle resistance as you linger in awareness, a pull to distract yourself, to fill the silence, to return to motion. That pull isn't random. The beast doesn't survive confrontation, but it does survive avoidance. When you stay present without reacting, its leverage dissolves. It can't negotiate with stillness. This is why clarity feels uncomfortable at first. It removes excuses. It removes the background noise the beast used to hide behind. You're not angry. You're not afraid. You're simply no longer unconscious. And unconsciousness was the only shelter it had. You start to understand that the beast never controlled you directly. It shaped the environment so you would control yourself. It influenced what felt possible, what felt safe, what felt realistic. And because it lived inside the house, you assumed its limits were yours. That assumption is now breaking. There's a quiet empowerment in this phase, but it isn't triumphant. It's sober. You're not reclaiming power by declaring dominance. You're reclaiming it by withdrawing belief. You stop believing every internal narrative just because it arrives confidently. You stop equating familiarity with truth. As this happens, the house begins to feel different. Lighter. More neutral. Less reactive. You don't fix anything yet. You don't tear walls down. You simply occupy spaces consciously, and consciousness changes the rules. What once influenced you invisibly now has to justify its presence. This is the turning point most people never reach. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires staying present longer than comfort allows. You stayed. You looked. You didn't rush to escape the discomfort of seeing clearly. And now the beast has a problem, because it can only survive where you're not looking. If you've been touched by God's goodness, don't keep it to yourself. Click Super Thank You, and sow a gift of $20 or more to help spread His light. Your giving becomes a ripple of grace, blessing hearts and building His kingdom. Let His overflow pour through you. Once the beast realizes it's being seen, it doesn't attack. It adapts. This is where many misunderstand the process. They expect resistance to look dramatic. Instead, it becomes subtle, rational, persuasive. It begins to speak in your own voice. You're overthinking. This isn't that deep. You've lived like this for years and survived. The goal isn't to frighten you. It's to normalize itself again. You notice how quickly it reframes awareness as inconvenience, how it suggests that clarity is exhausting, that questioning everything will ruin your peace. This is its last reliable defense. Not force, but fatigue. The beast doesn't need to overpower you. It only needs you to stop paying attention long enough for old patterns to resume control. But something has changed. You're no longer trying to get rid of it. You're observing it. And observation removes urgency. You don't argue with its logic. You don't suppress its presence. You simply note when it appears and what triggers it. This shifts the balance completely. What once felt inevitable now feels conditional. You begin to recognize how the beast benefited from your self-blame. Every time something went wrong internally, you assumed it was a personal flaw. You tried to fix yourself instead of examining the structure you were living inside. The beast thrived on that confusion. It preferred you exhausted, always correcting, always apologizing to yourself for reactions you didn't choose. Now, instead of asking what's wrong with me, you ask, what is this pattern protecting? That question changes everything. It turns confrontation into understanding. And understanding removes the need for domination. The beast begins to lose ground not because you're stronger, but because you're clearer. The house feels quieter in a new way. Not empty. Unpressured. You're not being pushed toward reaction. You're not being pulled into distraction. Space opens where noise used to live. That space can feel unfamiliar at first, even unsettling, but it's real. It belongs to you. You may notice a growing sense of authority, not over the beast, but over the house itself. You decide which rooms you enter, which thoughts you entertain, which emotional climates you allow to linger. This isn't control born of fear. It's stewardship born of presence. The beast hasn't disappeared yet. It doesn't vanish the moment it's seen, but it has lost its invisibility. And invisibility was its greatest strength. From here on, the story is no longer about discovery. It's about choice. Choice introduces a new kind of silence. Not the heavy silence that hides things, but the clear silence where intention can be felt. You notice that when you choose deliberately, the house responds. Certain rooms feel easier to enter. Others lose their pull. The environment begins to reorganize itself around awareness rather than habit. You realize now that the beast never forced you into anything. It offered defaults, easy paths, familiar reactions, and for a long time, defaults felt safer than decisions. Choice requires presence. It requires you to stay with discomfort long enough to let it pass without numbing it. That's why the beast thrived, because numbness was efficient. As you practice choosing, you see how often you used to abandon yourself internally. How quickly you'd override your own signals to maintain comfort, harmony, or routine. The beast lived in that override. It fed on the gap between what you felt and what you allowed yourself to acknowledge. Closing that gap doesn't create chaos. It creates coherence. The house begins to feel more responsive. When something doesn't belong, it stands out immediately. When something aligns, it settles naturally. You're no longer guessing. You're sensing. And sensing doesn't require effort, it requires honesty. This honesty isn't harsh. It's precise. It tells you when to rest, when to engage, and when to leave something untouched. You may feel moments of grief here. Not because anything was taken from you, but because you see how long you lived with something that limited you quietly. That grief doesn't linger. It passes through. It leaves behind respect for yourself, for the intelligence that kept you functioning even under misalignment. The beast responds to this phase by shrinking. Not dramatically, gradually. It has less space to occupy because fewer rooms are unattended. You don't evict it yet. You simply stop building around it. And structures that aren't maintained eventually collapse on their own. There's a new confidence forming, but it isn't loud. It's rooted. You trust yourself not because you're certain of outcomes, but because you're present with process. Whatever arises, you'll see it. Whatever hides, you'll notice the absence it creates. This trust becomes the foundation of the house going forward. The story is moving now toward resolution, not confrontation, not victory, but integration. The house doesn't need to be purged. It needs to be claimed. And claiming doesn't happen all at once. It happens one conscious choice at a time. As the house becomes claimed rather than contested, you notice something unexpected. Your energy returns. Not in bursts, not as motivation, but as availability. You're less tired without doing less. That's how you know something fundamental has shifted. The beast didn't just occupy space. It consumed attention. And attention, once reclaimed, restores capacity almost immediately. You begin to recognize how many of your past efforts were spent managing internal tension rather than moving forward. You weren't lazy. You weren't blocked. You were negotiating with something that no longer needed to exist. Now that negotiation has ended, not with force but with clarity, and the relief is measurable. The house feels more neutral now. Not constantly positive, not artificially calm, just honest. Emotions arise and pass without hijacking the structure. Thoughts appear without demanding obedience. You're no longer dragged into reaction before awareness arrives. This creates a subtle sense of authority that doesn't need assertion. You don't command the house. You inhabit it fully. The beast attempts one final strategy here: relevance. It reminds you of past pain, of mistakes, of moments when fear kept you safe. It argues that without it, you'll be exposed, vulnerable, reckless. But you can feel the difference now between protection and imprisonment. Protection adapts, imprisonment repeats, and repetition is no longer convincing. You see now that the beast was built from old intelligence. It learned during times when vigilance was necessary. It kept you functional when resources were limited. But the conditions that created it are no longer present. What once served has expired. Acknowledging this doesn't dishonor the past. It completes it. This is where compassion enters the process, not toward the beast, but toward yourself. You stop blaming yourself for having lived with it so long. You understand that you did what was required with the awareness you had. Growth isn't retroactive. It happens when readiness meets truth. That meeting is happening now. As this compassion settles, the house stabilizes further. There's no void where the beast once operated. There's space. And space invites choice, creativity, rest. You don't rush to fill it. You let it remain open long enough to feel what a house without quiet pressure is like. This phase isn't dramatic. That's its strength. Real change rarely announces itself. It integrates. It normalizes. One day you realize you're no longer bracing when you're alone. That your inner world doesn't ambush you when things go quiet. That peace no longer feels suspicious. The beast is still there, but it's no longer hiding. And what no longer hides no longer controls. What happens next is subtle, and that's why it lasts. The beast doesn't disappear in a moment of triumph. It loses relevance, and irrelevance is far more permanent than defeat. You notice days passing where you don't check for it anymore. Not because you're avoiding it, but because it no longer shapes your movement through the house. You begin to trust your inner space. Silence no longer feels like a setup. Stillness no longer feels like vulnerability. You can sit with yourself without bracing for intrusion. That alone tells you how much power the beast once held, and how little it holds now. Control rarely leaves loudly. It fades when attention is withdrawn consistently. You may notice how your reactions to the outside world change as well. Situations that once triggered urgency now feel proportionate. Conflict doesn't automatically enter your home with you. You don't carry external tension across the threshold anymore. The house has become a boundary, not a sponge. This separation restores clarity and preserves energy. There is also a shift in how you speak to yourself. The internal voice is less interrogative, less corrective. It doesn't rush to explain or justify. It observes, decides, and moves on. This voice isn't new. It was just buried under noise. Now it has space to operate without interference. You understand something important here. The beast didn't live in your house because it was stronger than you. It lived there because it was unquestioned. Once questioned, it couldn't evolve fast enough to keep up with awareness. Awareness doesn't argue. It outgrows. The house feels lived in now rather than managed. You're not constantly adjusting temperature, lighting, or structure to compensate for something unseen. You respond naturally. You rest naturally. You move naturally. These are signs of ownership, not control. There may still be moments when old patterns knock. Habits don't vanish instantly. But now you recognize the knock for what it is, a memory, not a mandate. You choose whether to answer. And often you don't need to. The silence itself communicates that the house has changed hands. This phase brings a quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself. You don't feel fixed. You feel present. And presence does what force never could. It keeps the environment honest. Nothing can hide for long where awareness lives consistently. The story isn't finished yet. Not because there's more danger, but because there's more integration. The house is no longer reacting. It's stabilizing. And stabilization prepares you for something the beast could never tolerate. Freedom that doesn't need rebellion. Freedom without rebellion feels almost unfamiliar at first. There's no rush, no surge of adrenaline, no need to prove that anything has changed. You simply notice that your choices are no longer reactive. You're not choosing against something. You're choosing from yourself. That distinction alters the entire atmosphere of the house. You may realize that much of what you once called discipline was actually resistance. You were holding yourself together against internal pressure. Now that pressure has eased, structure remains, but it's supportive rather than restrictive. You don't have to monitor every thought or manage every feeling. The house regulates itself because its foundation is no longer compromised. This is where true safety appears, not as protection from discomfort, but as trust in your ability to meet whatever arises. You don't avoid difficult thoughts anymore. You don't dramatize them either. You let them pass through rooms that are no longer furnished with fear. Without reinforcement, they lose weight quickly. You might notice a renewed creativity here. Not the frantic kind that escapes discomfort, but the grounded kind that emerges when space is available. Ideas arrive without urgency. Desires surface without desperation. You're free to explore without needing to justify exploration. This is the kind of freedom that doesn't demand permission. The beast cannot survive in this environment. Not because it's banished, but because it has no function. It thrived on tension, on vigilance, on unexamined habit. In a house governed by presence, those resources don't exist. What once felt like a constant background pressure now registers as a faint memory. There's also a quiet dignity in this phase. You don't announce what you've overcome. You don't measure progress by milestones. You live differently, and that difference speaks for itself. The house reflects you now, rather than shaping you in its image. As freedom settles, you understand something deeply reassuring. Nothing inside you needs to be hunted or destroyed to create peace. Awareness was always enough. Choice was always enough. You don't need to purge your past to move forward. You needed to inhabit your present fully. Only one part remains now. Not a warning, not a battle, a closing understanding that ties everything together, house, beast, and you, into a single, stable truth. The closing understanding arrives without tension. You see now that the house was never unsafe, it was unclaimed. And the beast was never a monster, it was a pattern that survived in the absence of presence. Nothing had to be destroyed for peace to emerge. Something only had to be owned. You understand why fear was never the right response. Fear feeds what it watches. Presence dissolves what it understands. The moment you stopped treating the beast as an enemy and started recognizing it as outdated intelligence, its influence faded naturally. It couldn't adapt to a house governed by awareness. It didn't belong there anymore. This reframes your entire inner history. You weren't weak for living with it. You were adaptive. You weren't late to change. You were precise. Change arrived when you could hold it without becoming reactive. That timing mattered. It ensured that freedom didn't turn into chaos and clarity didn't become rigidity. Now the house feels coherent. Not perfect, real. Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. But nothing hijacks the structure. Nothing hides in corners. Nothing feeds on neglect. You don't patrol your inner world, you inhabit it. And habitation is the deepest form of security. You may notice how this changes your relationship with the outside world as well. You don't bring conflict home with you. You don't outsource peace to circumstances. You don't need constant reassurance to feel stable. Your center is internal now, and that center holds regardless of what comes and goes. The beast no longer defines the story. Not because it was defeated, but because it's no longer relevant to who you are. Relevance is what gives patterns power. When relevance ends, influence ends with it. Quietly, permanently. If there is inspiration here, it's grounded and usable. Nothing inside you is too dark to face, and nothing needs to remain hidden once you're ready to see. Awareness is not a weapon. It's a light you carry naturally when you stop abandoning yourself. The house is yours now. Not because you secured it, but because you finally stayed.